Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. I'm wearing my Cornell shirt today because we have a special guest on the show. It is Mr. Carl Schimenti, urban environmental scientist at Cornell University. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Thanks a bunch for having me back, Micah. Always happy to chat with you about, we're going to chat some playability today, MLSN. I'm going to tell you why I communicate MLSN in the wrong way.
Uh, well,
and
well,
I'm sure we could have a good conversation about that.
yeah, I think talking with you about MLSN communication is perfect because you communicate it in a way that almost everybody seems to communicate it. And every year I do about 3 or 4 blog posts, and I've been doing this since 2013, saying that's not the way to do MLSN. And I know you know exactly where I'm coming from. I know exactly where you're coming from. And some people may know you from the fastest 30 minutes in turf, where you have to communicate things quickly. That's the Cornell Turfcraft show that you do with Dr. Frank Rossi. And when you're communicating a lot of information in 30 minutes, I can see why you just say if you're above MLSN, you don't need to apply potassium, you don't need to apply phosphorus, or so on. But I think there's more to it than that. You're not just rushing through it because it's a 30-minute show. You have a reason for explaining MLSN in the way you do. Can you explain to me why that is? Make your case.
Yeah, so I guess the issue with how I explain MLSN is that I simplify it down too much, right? It's not really meant to be if you're above, don't apply fertilizer, because it's just at one point in time, right? You will use those nutrients as time goes on, as you apply nitrogen, as the plants grow, and at some point in time, you will have to apply things like potassium or phosphorus when they get below levels that aren't sufficient to support turf growth. But the way I explain it is really just to simplify it down as the initial touch point, usually for people who haven't heard of MLSN, aren't aware of it, because there are still a lot of people that I talk to who, when I say MLSN, whoa, MLSN, what is that? And the easiest way to start with the explanation is that here's what is needed in the soil for the grass to use. And if you have above that amount on your soil test, the grass has all it needs and you don't need to apply. And really the way I've thought about it now, we've done some work with best management practices on golf course BMPs, and reading about how people adopt BMPs, especially in ag, is it seems like there's this 3-step approach. There's the moment where they become aware that a BMP is a BMP, right? So for the people who, quote, don't know that they don't know, you have to introduce that concept in a really sort of short, simple manner so that they become aware of, oh, this thing, MLSN, is a BMP. Oh, that's interesting. So that is the awareness part of it. And then there's the next step, which in our 30-minute turf show, usually we're not going to go to this next step, but is creating interest in doing that best management practice. That's where you need a little bit more information. And then the best way to create interest is to show a practitioner, so in ag, it would be a farmer, how other farmers use that BMP. Or in golf, it would be, hey, here's how other superintendents use that BMP. And the great part about that is you have all these resources, on the ATC website, on Pace Turf website, of all these superintendents who use MLSN. So what I do is when I introduce, that awareness component, hey, just stay above MLSN. Then people reach out to me, hey, I'm interested in this now. Great, I'm going to send you to all of Micah's stuff, because that's where you can see how it's actually used. And if you want to get that interest going in your head and, oh, wow, here's how much they saved, and oh, here's how the grass got better. That's the interest component. And then the final one is adoption, right? And that's sort of the mechanics of how am I going to do this? The spreadsheets that you have, the resources that Jason Haynes has produced in the past, things like Turfgrass Speedo, the advanced sort of concepts of that. That's where the adoption piece comes in. So it's this 3-step approach. And I find myself sort of on the front line of being the person who just creates awareness. And even though I know it's not as simple as, hey, if you're above this, don't apply. That's, I think, what creates the most awareness. And actually, that sort of three-step concept is why we produced this poster for BMPs.
Hmm.
So we sent this to all golf courses, and
Your camera's mirrored. Your camera's mirrored, so it. But
so
anyway,
fast.
you can explain what we're looking at in that poster.
Yeah. So for anyone who's listening on the podcast too, basically we have BMPs and we have pars, birdies, and eagles. So we have this same sort of three-step approach where we introduce people to a BMP with a par, which is the simplest, the most basic form of the BMP. And then, okay, once they get interested, they can go to the birdies and then eventually the eagles that get a little bit more advanced. They start to learn a little bit more about, okay, why is this a BMP? How do I do it? And the actual mechanics of it. So a lot of the reason I start with MLSN, simplifying it too much, is just to be that first sort of awareness piece in the equation.
Thank you. That was an excellent explanation, and I don't have much to disagree with you about that. If you just say the point that I want to emphasize is your grass is alive and it's using nutrients. As long as you communicate that you want to stay above MLSN, it's not that you check now you're above MLSN and it means you're fine going into the future. If you're above MLSN, it means you're fine at the time the sample was taken. But and so you can communicate it that simply and just say if you're above MLSN, your grass is fine now, and here's all these resources and interests, and people are using this all over the world, and they're getting great results with all kinds of grass at high quality places, at low budget places, everywhere in between. It just works really good, and it's a nice system to ensure you don't have any nutrient deficiencies. But I would hate at Bethpage Black. I think they have the Ryder Cup coming up next year, right? So let's say that they test in spring of 2025, and their potassium is 47 parts per million, and that's above MLSN. And if they interpreted that as we don't need to apply potassium this year, it's very likely that, depending on their soil and depending on but yeah, slightly depending on the soil, it's very likely that they'd be at something 30, 25 parts per million by the time of the Ryder Cup. And then, so the what I would say is the advanced way to use MLSN, the proper way to use MLSN, is you predict how much potassium the grass is going to use over the course of the year. So when you test in the spring of 2025 and you know that you're going to have the Ryder Cup, we're definitely going to put it on cruise control with MLSN, but we're going to say, well, we're going to apply 2 pounds of nitrogen this year. That's 100 kilograms per hectare. The grass is expected to use 1 pound of potassium if it uses that much nitrogen, or 50 kilograms of per hectare of potassium. That's how much it should use. So you would look at the difference between the soil test and MLSN and account for how much the grass would use, and you would make a recommendation based on that. And I can understand that that's a little bit difficult to communicate when you're exposing somebody to MLSN for the very first time and trying to get them actually to move to the next step of actually being interested in it. And to go math heavy from the start is probably not the way to go. But yeah, it just, every time I hear people interpret it in that way, and then they always show some qualifiers of like they don't quite trust MLSN, and it might be too low, and it's not quite like SLAN or something, and they put all these qualifiers, and I'm just like, just don't try to compare it to the way SLAN is. If you do MLSN by the right way, you will guarantee that the grass is supplied with enough, because it's not static. It's the soil test is looking backwards. The soil test is what you measured in the past. That's what the grass was growing in the past. The fertilizer recommendation is for the future. And that's why I often take the chance, I guess, to once people are using MLSN, I guess that's the time to try to get them to do it by the book.
It's so there's a couple of things there that I made a note. So you said the word "stay above MLSN." I really like that phrase because it communicates they've taken action. But a lot of times MLSN and almost all the soil samples I get from upstate New York, where mostly push-up greens or native soil lawns where the nutrient levels are way above MLSN. Oftentimes I'll say, you don't need fertilizer. Like, don't worry about it. Even if you were to project nutrient use over the next year, like they're so far above MLSN, they wouldn't need anything. But oftentimes when I say that, it's the opposite of an action, right? It's don't do this, don't do that. And people don't respond as well when you say, hey, just sit there, don't do anything, versus giving them an action, which is stay above MLSN. And that gets in their brain, okay, it's an active thought when, okay, I soil test this year. Okay, stay above MLSN. It says I'm, above MLSN right now. When am I going to get below? Okay, I have to stay above that. So that can drive them into the thinking of, okay, how do I use growth potential or my future nitrogen applications to predict when I'll be below MLSN so I can apply fertilizer so I never get to that point. So I like the idea of telling them an action, stay above, but that may not happen nearly as frequently. It won't happen nearly as frequently as using other soil test interpretations. So I really like that. I don't know if you can hear the noise in the background, Micah. There's a dog and a baby going crazy. Hopefully.
Well, that's cool. That's a very low volume sound, and I do hear it, and that adds some authenticity to this show. So, thank you. Yeah, you're.
So let's see. I had one other point too, the comparison to SLAN.
Okay.
And this is funny because I do this very often, but only in the context of what will the total amount of fertilizer applied be if you use MLSN versus SLAN over the course of the year. And so in our turf show, I presented that data at Sunken Meadow, where it's like, wow, we soil tested fairways, and SLAN recommended a lot more fertilizer than MLSN. And the point of that is, again, to communicate, man, MLSN is typically, and it won't always, but very often what we see is it will recommend applying less than SLAN. And then the other piece of that is, okay, if people are hearing this for the first time, okay, less fertilizer, that's probably going to mean the turf's not going to look as good, right? And that's when I go to Jackie Guevara's research at Michigan State, where it's, so I think that's the first one that's shown MLSN versus SLAN, okay, the turf quality is no different. And that's sort of the reaffirming, in addition to all of the evidence that superintendents who've adopted this have seen their grass improve, or at the very worst not change. So that's the evidence of, hey, you can apply less fertilizer, you can apply it basically more efficiently, not waste as much money, and you get the same, if not better, results. That's all that awareness piece at the front that I'm trying to communicate, and then hopefully get them into some of your information, which is the interest and the adoption piece at the end.
Very good. Very good. I'm going to bring up a QR code that I think is going to show on the screen. So for those of you watching this, there's a QR code where you can sign up for my free ATC newsletters. One of those is the MLSN newsletter. MLSN is what we're talking about. It's a way to interpret soil tests in a very modern way to make fertilizer recommendations for turf grass. And there's a newsletter, and just last week I sent out the 23rd of these newsletters, the 23 of them since 2017. MLSN, we've been doing this since 2012. It's in its 12th year now, and we started a newsletter. There are more than 1,000 subscribers to this who get this from all over the world, and I'm sure that there's more people than that actually using MLSN. It's used at a lot of golf courses all around the world. So that's something that if you're not signed up to that yet, I'll put a direct link to that in the show notes also. It's something that I often put updates about, and it's surprising to me, Carl, how many updates there are. I send that out every 5 or 6 months, and I always think over a 3-month period, I'm like, wow, I've started to do a number of blog posts, or somebody's talked about MLSN on this podcast, or somebody did a research project about MLSN. Did you listen to that Talking Greenkeeper episode with Joe Galati? And I think the superintendent's name was Daniel Palin from a course in Kentucky, and he did a 9 holes he fertilized according to MLSN, and 9 with one of the more expensive foliar fertilizer programs that you could use, and noticed absolutely no difference. And so he saved so much money. He switched all the greens to MLSN and was able to invest in some equipment or some tines or some sand that was going to change the physical properties and make some meaningful improvements to the course. And I just thought that was terrific. And he said the feedback he was getting was the greens were the best they've ever been, which is, as a golf course superintendent, I think just what you love to hear.
That's I got to go listen to that now. I didn't know Joe did a podcast with him, but that's the stuff that creates interest, right? When I can tell a superintendent, and that's Joe, a superintendent, talking to another superintendent who's done that, and again, taken from BMP research and ag, very often the sort of primary reason someone will begin to implement a BMP is when they see their peers do it, when they get interested in, the person down the road does this. Oh, that's interesting. Or there's a sort of like a keystone farmer in a community, or a lot of times there's a keystone superintendent in a region. When they start doing something, everybody else looks to, oh, that, so-and-so is doing that. Oh, maybe I should do that. So that's that's going to be a cool thing to listen to, and something I'm going to tell people, hey, you want to know how this works on an actual golf course? Here's a person who tried it on 9 holes versus another program. Like, that's essentially research, right? That's research, but it's in the field and it's an actual superintendent, and that lends validity to those results. That is really, honestly, that's better than research we do on plots, because it's an actual golf course with actual golfers, different, topography of greens, probably different growing conditions. Usually that stuff resonates a lot more to other superintendents when it's on an actual golf course. So that's cool. I gotta go listen to that.
That's cool. Yeah, I had no idea that was coming up, and I was like, should I even listen to this episode? Because it's like, what are they going to be talking about? And then they just kicked it off with like this MLSN experiment on the golf course, and then I was nervous. I was like, oh my, what if MLSN just fell flat on its face, and he's like, this just didn't work.
It's never fell. But Mike, I've never heard of someone, and maybe you have, and maybe it's one, or maybe it's a couple instances, but I still have not run into anybody who has actually tried MLSN and said, yeah, it didn't work and I had to go back. I still haven't run into anybody. I don't know if you have, but
no,
anybody like that.
No, I haven't, but it's possible if you don't do MLSN the right way, it's possible to fail, because you could get your nutrient levels low enough. Let's take, for example, the Rutgers research green, where Chaz Schmidt did his work with potassium on Poa annua.
Yeah.
And they saw winter damage in the plot that did not get potassium, and they saw, I think they saw more anthracnose in the plot that did not get any potassium. And they reported the results as like stay above a certain soil test level or keep a certain amount in the tissue. But if you look at what the treatments were, all you had to do was apply the first increment of potassium. Once you applied the first increment of potassium and corrected the deficiency, then you got the improved winter performance and you got the improved disease resistance. And that one, if you would interpret for their climate how much potassium the grass would use, using MLSN, you would never give a 0. MLSN would not be a 0 potassium recommendation there. MLSN would have been a 1 pound of potassium recommendation. And so that's like the situation where, but they tested it, and I think they were like at 40 parts per million or something at the start of the year. But of course, that's above MLSN for potassium. But using MLSN the way that I want everybody to do it, the way that it's designed to be used, is that's what your potassium was at the start of the year. But going through the year, the grass is going to use potassium, so you need to apply some. And that's the kind of situation where potentially you could run into trouble if you fail to do MLSN by the book.
I think and that's the study, right, that looked at, that basically said, okay, there's tissue levels you need to stay above in terms of potassium to prevent anthracnose. And then they correlated that into a soil test parts per million. I think it was like 55 parts per million.
A little bit lower.
Just a little
They
bit lower.
generally recommend 50, but
Okay.
but the but then there's no
That's the
time.
start of the study, right?
Here's what kills me. Here's what frustrates me so much about SLAN interpretation. If you say you want to be at 50, then the implication is like always above 50 because the soil's going to go down as the grass uses nutrients. And so there's no time component, where with MLSN, the time component is explicitly tied to how long you're making a fertilizer recommendation for. So if you just interpret MLSN, if you use MLSN saying we're above MLSN, we're not going to apply fertilizer, well, that was a valid recommendation for the day you took the soil test, but it's not a valid recommendation for the next day. And so if you start making recommendations for 1 year, like I tend to do, then we need to look at expected use over the upcoming 1 year. So with MLSN, it's very explicit. The recommendation accuracy is tied, and the length of the recommendation is explicitly tied to how long you're making the recommendation for. For what period, what time duration are we making a fertilizer recommendation? When you look at what comes out of those kind of studies, and then they say, okay, you want to be at 50, and then it's like, well, you want to be at 50 all the time, or you want to be like, what is the interpretation of that? And it's not so clear. And with SLAN, it's the same way. And I think with SLAN, that's why the SLAN values, and I've written a couple blog posts about this recently. I think the reason why the SLAN values are so high, like for potassium, instead of 30 parts per million, it's 117 parts per million. And what's the reason for that? Because there's no explicit time component involved with that. And and sometimes you'll see, okay, do a soil test every 2 or 3 years. And then
Right.
with MLSN, we're also linking it to specific grass types and specific nitrogen rates that you are going to use. It's very site specific. It's how many nutrients are going to be used at your site. And SLAN is supposed to work for everywhere. So that value is supposed to be it's supposed to work for Miami Bermuda grass. It's supposed to work for Maine velvet bentgrass, and it's supposed to work for Vancouver, British Columbia, Poa annua. And the problem is you have to have a huge margin of error if it's going to work for all those places with no explicit time component. The reason why we can go so much lower with MLSN and still have 12 years into the project, nobody, as far as we know, nobody has ever had a deficiency with this. And the reason is because we have a very explicit time component built into it, but it allows so much more efficiency that way by doing things on a site specific way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So yeah, that's why I explain it wrong, Micah. And I view myself as the first sort of entry point for people. And then, I really like all your resources, and you have a lot of different ones, and they communicate in different ways, which is good because I can sort through, okay, someone gets in touch with me about MLSN. Okay, I can sort of gauge their knowledge level and then send them to that sort of level to meet their level in all your resources, which is really nice.
Cool. Well, thank you for all of that nice talk about MLSN. I'm going to put in the show notes a link to the MLSN page, which has lots of resources about MLSN. Let's move to the next topic, the one that's really, really exciting. Carl, I was just thinking, you used to be a golf professional, and actually a touring professional, not just a club professional. So you were playing in tournaments, trying to make a living at this. Do you know anybody else in the turfgrass science field who has been a golf professional, a touring professional?
There's got to be somebody out there, I would think. Um, but yeah, I think it's my level of professional golf was we'd call it mini tour golf. Like I never got to PGA Tour Canada or Latin America or Asia at the time. So in the scheme of touring professionals, I was at the very bottom, and only 2 years. It took me about 2 years to figure out, okay, I'm not that good to basically make money doing it. But so it's an interesting perspective to come at turf from. So as an undergrad at Cornell, I worked for Dr. Rossi just mowing plots as an undergrad, coming in, mowing plots, taking ball roll. We were doing brush work at the time. Bill Kreuzer was there doing his Civitas work. And I didn't really learn a whole lot about turf. I learned about the mowers. I learned to hand mow. I learned about the different sort of types of grasses, but I didn't really pick up on a whole lot, to be honest. It was more, hey, I get to work really early in the morning and then go play golf in the afternoon. And it wasn't until after I played professional golf that I linked back up with Frank and actually started learning about grass. And it was sort of an eye-opening experience. I never really understood all the things that go into the management of the grass. And it's actually made me think more about when I play a golf course, how the ball is reacting and why it's reacting like that. Is it because of the soil or the grass or how they irrigate or the textures of the grasses? So that's how I've sort of really taken to the idea of playability and being able to sort of notice those things at a high level as a really good golfer. And then also now having the knowledge of, okay, how do we manage them in different sorts of ways that we could improve the golfer experience? It's been sort of a circuitous route to get to that knowledge. But yeah, now we really study that very intensely, especially on putting greens.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting background to be working on the turf grass side and to have the background of playing golf competitively. And I know other people have played competitively at the amateur level. I think Jim Kearns, qualified for the U.S. Amateur one year, I
Cool.
think, which impressed me. And I know there's a number of other highly skilled golfers. And you know what really impresses me, because my golf game has, let's say the scores that I shoot have gone down. No, I mean they've gone up, right? I shoot more and more above par with every year that goes by. My handicap goes up. I play less golf and I get much worse. You know what really impresses me is people like Dr. Brosnan and Dr. Horvath down at the University of Tennessee, where I'm an adjunct professor, and their handicap, like they play golf and practice and get better. And what I've found is when I play golf and practice, I get worse. Well, obviously I'm doing it wrong, and maybe I'm just a terrible athlete or whatever. So I'm impressed with people who in their 40s, who middle-aged people who can improve and drop their handicap by a number of strokes. I find that very impressive. So there are a lot of people in this industry on the research side who do have an appreciation of fine golfing conditions and an understanding of them. But I think you certainly would be right up there with your background. And that's why I wanted to talk with you about the quality of ball roll, assessing the quality of ball roll. I think you're one of the few people out there who's quite familiar with the bobble test, who also uses the USGA's GS3 ball. And I wanted to talk with you about that and about maintenance and things that make the green smoother or bumpier or whatever. So do you have, I'll start off with this. How long have you been using the GS3?
So we got the GS3, I think it was the start of 2023. So we had an entire year last year where we used the GS3 on our research plots for some of our golf footwear studies, where we traffic the greens and measure the disruption to the putting surfaces across different people who walk and then different types of shoes to figure out what makes a shoe greens friendly or not. And we've also been able to use that GS3 on a variety of courses in New York State. So we work As you know, with the state park, New York State Park golf courses, we go to routinely every year about 15 of those. So we can take the GS3 and take it across all those golf courses and get a lot of data back. And we've also had it this year as well. So we're basically a year and a half into getting that GS3 data,
And,
and then also doing the bobble test, especially when we do our research plot work here in Ithaca. Being able to look at the bobble test versus the GS3 and see which things make sense and sometimes which things don't make sense. And it's a really interesting sort of case study in what our eyes can see versus what the accelerometers in the ball can pick up. So that's been sort of interesting to look at.
yeah, can you elaborate on that? Let me describe the bobble test. Do you use the scale that I recommend, which is one clear chatter or snaking is an 8. 2 of them would be a 7. And if you're undecided, if you can't tell if there's been any imperfection in the roll, it's a 9. And if there's obviously none, it's a 10.
So it's I would say R9 is one disruption, either one snaking event or one bobble. So we probably would be scaled up. And I have only administered a 10 once ever. So I can usually pick up almost every time I'll pick up a bobble or a chatter. So we would be scaled up 1. And then 6 is if I see a bobble, right, it comes completely off the ground, you immediately go to 6, right?
Right.
So
I immediately go to 6. So yeah. A 6 is basically for me, 8 is minimally acceptable. Because, even I was watching some highlight videos of the recent US Open at Pinehurst, and you can see the ball was snaking at the end of almost every roll on television when they show it in. Actually, you didn't have to be in slow motion to see the snaking, I don't think. It's common. And I'm not saying those greens are bad. Those greens are excellent. But it's normal when the ball comes to the end of its roll, if it falls sideways, if it makes a little twist sideways as it slows down and comes to a stop, that's a snaking event, and that puts it at 8. And perhaps when there's some more turgor in the leaves, when there's more moisture in the leaves in the morning, you may not see that. And then at the end of the day, even if there were no footprints across the surface, no pitch marks there, but just as the surface dries down, you could have some snaking happening. Or you could have the greens move into a condition where the ball is going to snake. So it's interesting. I have not used the GS3. I really like the bobble test for its simplicity. And I think, so you said how many golf courses across the state in the park system?
So we've got 15 in the state park system, and then we've taken the GS3 probably to at least 7 others.
Okay. So if you go and make a bobble test score there, is it pretty comparable in like for example, if you measure and the average is 8.6 at Bethpage Black, and then you go to the Bethpage Green or Bethpage Red and you measure 8.4 on average, is that that's something that you then could go to another Montauk or some other state park golf course and you measure a 7.6? Are those like on the same scale? Is that with the bobble test, is that comparable for you?
So the short answer is not always. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. I don't think I can get into, and we've talked with the USGA folks about their algorithm and how they calculate these smoothness and trueness numbers.
But I'm asking about the bobble right now, not the GS3.
Okay. Yeah. So the bobble is
I'm setting you up for this because I think that I can go to a course in Vietnam with Seashore Paspalum greens, measure a bobble of 7.3, and it's very clear what that ball roll looked like as a golfer, right? I'm making this rating as a turfgrass scientist, but I'm I'm looking at it with eyes like a golfer would. And then I could go to a Zoysia green in Bangkok and get a rating of 6.7 on average because we take multiple rolls. And I can go to a bentgrass green in Japan and get 8.5 or and and it's comparable, I think, because we're looking at how the ball rolls as a golfer looks at it. And I wonder with
Yeah.
you, so you doing that course by course around New York State, and with your even better golfer's eye looking at how the ball rolls, does the bobble test give you something that's comparable?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It is and I think that's the good part about it is that, if what you're trying to measure is what golfers perceive as a true and smooth roll, the bobble test absolutely does that. And really, most people who start doing the bobble test when we have our new employee Chase, who's been with us for a year, or some undergrads that are coming on this summer, we sort of train them up on bobble tests, and it's pretty quick. And they're golfers, so again, they sort of see the same things I'm seeing. It's pretty quick to understand the scale, and as a golfer, when you look at that very intently, how that ball rolls, it is a great way to assess green to green or course to course how that ball is rolling, from what a golfer would perceive as a smooth and true roll or not so much. So absolutely, it's an easy way to sort of get an idea of the quality of roll wherever you are in New York State or beyond. I think that's a really good way
Cool.
to use it.
I thought that you would say that because that's been my experience with it. And this is something that I've told the story before. I never did the bobble test. I was aware of it. I thought it was kind of silly. I thought it's not necessary because I've been measuring green speed for a long time with a stimp meter. And I just assumed that the stimp meter measurement was capturing the smoothness because I just figured that the ball wasn't going to roll a long distance unless the green was smooth enough. And I also assumed that golf course superintendents were looking at the roll closely enough that if they realized there was an issue that the stimp meter wasn't capturing, that it wasn't something that we really needed to put a number to. We just needed to fix it. And then I've told the story about measuring greens in Thailand at an above average green speed in Thailand. The pro telling me, somebody who's also played on the Asian tour, telling me that he couldn't quite place it. He couldn't quite describe it, but the greens weren't as good as they used to be. And I saw it immediately, but I was like, why have I not been measuring the bobble test? Because the green speed was fast enough. It was above average for Thailand, and the ball was just constantly chattering. Just chatter. It rolled pretty. It did not much snaking, but it was just complete chatter all through the roll, which means up and down, but your eye cannot perceive that the ball leaves the ground. When the reason why I like to do this with our eye instead of with a camera, if you start doing this in slow motion, you'll see that what looks like chatter to your eye, the ball actually is leaving the ground, but our eyes don't catch it. So I don't recommend like shooting videos of it and analyzing videos. It's very difficult to tell on video. I really like just look at it with our eyes.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. As soon as you slow motion a putt, so I've done this and I notice many more sort of disruption events, minor chatters, minor snakes. And when you watch a broadcast, especially in the US, when they get that worm cam, like at the US Open, I got to go back and record it. But there's a putt Rory hits, I think on maybe it's the 15th or 14th, 13th hole, somewhere around there. But in slow motion, you can see how the ball takes a real sort of snaking event halfway through the roll that almost displaces it like a half an inch. And he misses the putt to the left, and he misses the putt to the left. And you sort of wonder, okay, what was the role of that one displacement event in the outcome of the putt? And this is where I'll start to share some of the stuff we've worked with FootJoy, because they're the ones who sponsor our golf footwear research. And when I showed them the bobble test, they thought a lot like you originally did. They're like, oh, that's the bobble test? Like, that's a real sort of, janky way to do it. Is, oh, you just roll it and you rate it 1 to 10. And so I did a bunch of plots, and they're like, okay, I trust you rating it. But man, what they do when they test their shoes is they want a sort of quantitative outcome, especially when it comes to strokes gained. So in when they're testing shoes when golfers are swinging, they can figure out, okay, does this golfer wearing this shoe hit it farther and straighter? And that can be transitioned directly into strokes gained. So you can gain, I don't know, a tenth of a shot by switching into a different shoe. When they want to look at their shoes and how friendly they are to the greens, they want to be able to correlate the disruption into strokes gained putting. Do you make more putts or miss more putts because of wearing a certain shoe? And this is the disconnect between how the ball rolls and the outcome of the putt. So our bobble test is measuring, perceived quality of the roll, right? The path of the roll, how smooth and true it is. Our question that Frank and I ask all the time is, does that correlate to the outcome of the putt? So would a lower bobble test, let's say a 5 or a 4, have a larger spread of variance, like the spread test that Eric Reasoner's done? Does that lead to more variance in the outcome compared to a bobble test of 8 or 9? And we don't really have an answer to that, because it should be really easy. You should just be able to release a golf ball off of a ramp 100 times in a row and sort of plot the spread test, right? And I think you've written about that,
Mm-hmm.
where, in an ideal world, you roll 100 balls and you sort of plot the end outcomes, and then you measure, how big or small a spread that is. The issue is this legacy effect that happens as soon as you roll a ball down a ramp. It makes a little bit of a groove in the green, because this is living tissue. It sort of gets, depressed a little bit. The very next ball you will roll will basically stay in that groove and then roll a little bit further, because the rolling friction has been reduced from the first ball. And then every subsequent ball will sort of stay on that same path. And I think Doug Lindy showed this in a video long ago on aerated greens, where he was doing this, the hole out test at that point. He was rolling
The,
and
yeah,
you could see it
the
tracking.
holing out test.
Yep, the holing out test. And you could see it tracking on a cord green that hadn't even been filled with sand yet. You could see it sort of tracking. And that really confounds our ability to do this sort of outcome-based test on greens. So it's what we're trying to do now is develop that sort of outcome test to figure out, does the bobble test correlate to more consistent or more varied outcomes? And then does the GS3 pick up things that we don't see in the bobble test that we do see in our outcome test? And that's the disconnect between how the ball gets to a place and where that ball ends up in space. So those are the sort of the nitty gritty things that we're trying to figure out about putting greens and the quality of roll. And ultimately, can we have a consistent outcome if we are hitting the ball from the same exact place with the same exact launch conditions and force? I would define a smooth and true green, or a really high quality green, as a green that has very consistent outcomes if you are hitting that putt the exact same way every time. And I would define a poor green as one where you get a variety of different outcomes when you hit that putt at the same force in the same direction. So that's how we're trying to sort of compare all these things and figure out which metrics matter to the golfer in terms of their performance.
Yeah, I I think that's. Let's see, where do we go from here?
There's a lot
Doug
of stuff
Lindy.
there.
Yeah, Doug. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. So Doug Lindy has an excellent paper. I'll put a link to that also. It's open source, so you can read it. It was in the International Turfgrass Research Journal a few years ago, if I remember the journal right. And he's done a lot of benchmarking work, which just like measuring what greens are like. And he did a very interesting study where he looked at 3 particular methods of assessing smoothness and trueness of putting greens. One of them is called the holing out test, which you typically do with a curved ramp. The greens tester. The RNA was recommending this for a while. I was quite keen on this for a while. and I recommended to various places that they should get a greens tester, because all we care about is the outcome. So it was the same thing that people talk now. Don't worry about speed so much. You just want smooth and true greens. Well, the idea with the greens tester and the holing out test, the greens tester is like a stimp meter, but it has a curved ramp, and you line it up. And because it's a curved ramp, it doesn't bounce so much when it first hits the green, although there's still a small bounce. Anyway, the idea was that if you could make like 10 out of 10 putts, then that's the desired outcome. The goal of golf is to get the ball in the hole. So if the green is reliable, so that was a score of reliability. How reliable is the green at delivering the ball into the hole? There's a couple problems with that. The one problem is tracking. Although, there's the tracking effect when you roll all the balls in the same place. It depends on the grass species and stuff.
Yep.
It's not like every green is going to have that effect, but it's a big enough problem that everybody needs to be concerned about it. And basically, we kind of are not so keen on that method. But the other big problem, which is documented well in this article that we're talking about, and I've noticed it also, I think anybody who's done this will have noticed it, you can go on greens that are extremely grainy and have spike marks. You can go on greens that have recently been aerified. And all of the imperfections on the green cause the ball to bounce right, bounce left. On average, the ball still goes in the hole. So you have greens where you can look at the ball and it looks like it's going across a bed of nails or something, just bouncing around, and it goes in the hole. And you do that again, and that one goes in the hole. And you're like, it's obviously an unacceptable quality green, and yet it's testing you're making 9 out of 10. So then I'm like, okay, I can't do this test. Well, anyway, there's also a spread test where you roll a whole bunch of balls and you measure their finishing point, how dispersed that is. And Eric Razor did a project. He was a graduate student with Jim Brosnan at the University of Tennessee. I was also involved with that project and helped with that. And so that's a dispersion thing that also suffers from the tracking effect a little bit. And anyway, Doug Lindy did that dispersion also, a different type of dispersion, because you would think that a really good putting green, all the balls are going to finish very close to each other. And then he did the bobble test. Well, it turned out when they did a survey of golfers and they asked the golfers, how do you rate these greens? The golfers' rating matched very well with the bobble test score, but they had all these, the problem with the dispersion and the holing out test is all the imperfections tend to balance out. And so the ball rolls terribly across the surface, but the score is not bad. The bobble test, when the ball rolls terribly across the surface, it's going to get a 4 or a 3 or something. And you're like, this is clearly a green that could be improved. Yeah. And it matches what golfers see. So how about the GS3? Because I'm a little bit skeptical after seeing what the perimeter did and seeing that there's so many problems with the perimeter, to make it not giving a consistent score in my experience. And I wonder what you've seen or what you can say about the GS3, because I haven't heard anybody raving about this that is really consistent.
So yes, I would say there are inconsistencies when we look at the bobble test versus the GS3. Part of that is we got when we initially got them a year and a half ago. I think our unit was an earlier model. We wore it pretty good, and I think you do the firmness drop with it too. I think our device probably didn't have the durability, that initial one that was sort of a demo unit. So our first year of data really didn't look very much like our bobble test at all. It was basically an R squared of 0 when you plotted them on a scatter plot. But the USGA guys gave us a new ball this year, and this year it's making more sense. The data we're getting, The bobble test scores correlate fairly well to the smoothness scores. We haven't done a ton of testing yet, but that makes sense in my head because when I administer the bobble test, most, if not almost all of the disruption events are in the Y direction, up and down, either chatter or bobble. When I'm doing it on bent or POA or bent POA greens up in the Northeast. And so it makes sense that the bobble test, because it's predominantly chatter or bobble based, when I'm deducting points, is correlating to the smoothness reading in the GS3, which is measuring the disruption in the Y direction. But I'm not seeing that correlation between bobble test and trueness, which is in the GS3 is the measure of the lateral deflection, or we could call that the X direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and when you look at the relative numbers, like the smoothness will be, I don't know, a 2.5 on the GS3, and the trueness will be a much lower number, like 0.5. That's sort of an indication of the relative force the golf ball is experiencing in the Y direction, something like 5 times more disruption than in the X direction laterally. And it makes sense that if my eyes are mostly picking up the Y direction, they probably aren't picking up the minute, very minor sort of snaking events that can occur during a roll that I don't see in real time. And if I slow-mo a putt and slow it down, I can maybe see, a couple snaking events that I wouldn't have otherwise seen when I roll it in real time. So it's interesting that we don't see the connection between the bobble test and the trueness scores, but we do the smoothness scores.
Mm-hmm.
So that's making a little bit more sense now. And I think the way they calculate those scores, we've talked to them a little bit in the past about their algorithm and how they calculate those things. And I think they'll continue to refine that because I think that is the way they will start to correlate these things or align them a little bit more with the bobble test than they have in the past. But also, it may be that, hey, the bobble test is not good at figuring out those tiny little lateral deflections that, if you think about it in terms of the outcome of a putt, a golfer is probably more worried about a lateral deflection, getting it offline, than they are a vertical deflection, because the vertical deflection is going to generally keep it right on line. It may lose a little bit of force or may sort of slow the green down. But actually in our testing of shoes, we measure stimp meter readings and the bobble test. The stimp meter readings never really change significantly when you traffic a plot, when we simulate 140 rounds. But the bobble test ratings change a lot. So that upward deflection doesn't really take a whole lot of force out of the roll.
Mm-hmm.
Probably keeps it online, but the lateral deflections are where, okay, does that change the outcome of a putt? And maybe I can't see that.
Yeah,
It's
pretty cool. Let's summarize this by saying, because I've got I want to show a chart and then some videos that I made just for you. That if my system works, I can play these videos. They've never been seen before. And so nice. For those who are watching it, they can see these. But we'll just kind of summarize this last section, what we've been talking about. As a former professional golfer, you like the bobble test for its ease of it's easy to administer and it matches what you see. The GS3 is picking up some things that maybe we can't see with the bobble test, so it seems to have some potential, but nobody is quite explaining exactly what that is right now. But you're optimistic for the future.
I am, yeah.
Okay. Let me show some bobble test data now. I'm sharing my screen. For those of you listening, I will describe what we're looking at. This is a blog post from last year. I did it right after the KBC Augusta tournament. It has a title, "One Additional Chatter or Snaking Event in Every Third Ball Roll." And I showed the chart that of the average bobble test from the KBC Augusta tournament in 2023. That's on Zoysia Greens at the end of August, the last week of August in 2023. And I was there. I think I made the first measurement on Sunday afternoon, and it was 7.7 on average. This is the average of 9 bobble test measurements. So the bobble test you measure at the same time that you're taking a stimp meter reading, and I was doing the exact same 3 greens where I painted marks on three different locations on each green, and they had marks painted on them, and then I had so three points to measure per green, and 3 greens. So total is 9 stimp meter measurements. Each stimp meter measurement is 3 balls in one direction, 3 balls rolled in the other direction. Each one of those rolls gets a bobble test score. So then we get something that we can take an average of. And so it started off in the afternoon, 7.7, and then it was always, all through the week, it was smoother in the morning, and it dropped a little bit in the afternoon. Do these numbers make sense to you, Carl?
These definitely make sense that the bobble test gets lower in the afternoon after traffic and maybe a little bit of growth. Probably not too much considering this is a tournament week. I would say on our research plots, we measure a larger reduction in bobble test readings.
And that's no surprise because these are zoysia greens that are heavily regulated.
Yeah.
So because of that, they're not growing a huge amount, but actually this year they were growing quite a bit. But zoysia is just so stiff. And so because of that, footprints don't do much to it. Pitch marks don't do much to it. And so from morning to afternoon, you can put 150 rounds of golf on it, and it doesn't go down too much. I've also measured this on bank grass at a couple of tournaments, and one course had relatively firm greens, and it was dropping by about 1 point. So instead of here, it's dropping by about 0.3 points on the bobble test score scale from morning to afternoon, which is the equivalent of 1 extra chatter or 1 extra stanking event for every 3 rolls. And what I've noticed on bank grass is it tends to be a single chatter or snaking event extra every single roll. So I think that's just a species effect. But like I look at that and say, this is giving us nice information. We can compare it to how it would be on bank grass. It's like it's picking up the morning values. It's picking up the decrease through the afternoon. For me, I kind of like it. So I think you might have tweeted at me or emailed or something during the week. And you said, Micah, what about if you check right around the hole? Well, now we'll move to the videos that I've never before shown. So this is going to be one of those rare episodes if this technology works. I've uploaded these videos, and I'll show. So this might be a good one if you're listening to it. Check out the video because this might be good. So this is the 11th hole at Kea Golf Club, and this is on Sunday, the final round. And so I was walking up, and actually one of my stimp locations was right here by this nice hole location on the Sunday afternoon. So I was out there after the final round, and those are some of the measurements that you saw where it declined on the final round, I think from 9.1 to, what did I show previously? I showed previously, it went from 9 down to 8.7. So that was at my fixed stimp locations, which I took that video, I think, to show you that my usual stimp locations are often, they happen to be quite close to where the hole locations are. And in fact, I've got another stimp location that's on this green that's just to the right of that. So all the golfers would have to walk across there to go to the next tee, and then there's another one even farther to the right. So what I was trying to show with this video is like I want to show that the places where I'm stimping is also the places where I'm recording the bobble test is where golfers are walking. Yep. And then I went to the 4th hole, and on. Let's see. I was waiting there as the final group was hitting their final putt. So here is Ai Miyazato's brother. I forget his
Oh, cool.
first name, but he was in the final group, and so he holes out, and this is the 13th hole for the tournament, the fourth hole for the member play. So they move off the green, and then I went and set up a tripod on the green and recorded 1 meter from the hole doing the bobble test. So let's look at that. And as I've said, and as you know, looking at bobble test on video is not quite the same as looking at it with our eyes from the right kind of angle. But I thought you'd like to see this, and
Yeah.
I thought it was a nice sunny day. It's fun to look at this video. So, so I set this up on a tripod, and we're looking at the fourth green, and I'm going to take a measure, a tape measure, and I'm going to measure 1 meter from the hole location. Now this is just after that last group has gone out. So each segment here is 20 centimeters, I think, and there's 5 segments on this. So this particular tape is now going to be 1 meter in length. So I measure from the edge of the hole 1 meter, and I put a T there, and then I said, okay, this is not my regular spot, but I said let me just show this for Carl. Let me do the bobble test at this location, 1 meter away from the hole location, and then I went and got my stimp meter.
It's remarkable how little spike damage I can see after.
It's Zoysia. Yeah. So
that is crazy.
Yeah. So there's various issues with Zoysia that make it not real good, but one really nice thing, if it's well maintained, is there's no pitch marks and no scuff marks. So this first one rolled a little bit too far, and I thought, okay, it's getting in the way of the camera, so I moved the stimp meter back. So that one for me was a 9. I can't really tell if there's anything wrong with it. That one looked like it was one little snaking event, so that's an 8 for me. That one snaked right at the end, so that's an 8. So that's 988 for my score.
Yep.
And I don't know how you rate those.
I actually would have had it 988 as well,
which is remarkable.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting that it's the snaking. I don't. Yes, there's one snake there.
Let's so I can pause this video and bring it back. Yeah, let's talk about what we've looked at a little bit before we roll them in this direction. You were saying it's interesting that you don't see much chatter. So keep in mind that so the greens are regulated, double cut and rolled in the morning, single cut and rolled in the afternoon. And they'd had this treatment for 7 days in a row now. And so it was an average score of 9 in the morning, and then on this day, and then I'm coming after play. So this is after the cut. So I suppose it's 70 or 80 golfers, 70 or 80 rounds. All right. So I think so now we'll look for chatter. We'll look for bobble if the ball leaves the ground. We'll look for snaking, rolling. Now we're rolling. We're looking at rolling away from the camera. And unfortunately I can't stimp and zoom the camera at the same time. So it's
yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. There was one snaking event at the beginning.
So
we're actually right around that tee. I would say there's maybe 2 in that roll. So 9-8 is what I'd have it. And that would be a 9.
Yeah. So you see, so I'm rating on average. Wow. So I guess I wanted to take that just to show you of like this is realistic.
Oh yeah.
And I'm measuring like before play, after play. It's interesting. I've seen some greens on bent grass where the greens were really soft in a professional tournament where they went from like 9.3 in the morning to in the sixes
Yep.
after play around the hole.
Mm.
They're still quite good if you get away from the hole. I understand what people are talking about, and that's where we're going way beyond MLSN. And we're going into other techniques that I recommend, such as measure the clipping volume, grow less grass, measure the total organic material, and you can take steps to keep the growth under control, keep the organic material under control that might allow you to have surfaces at the end of the day that are a bit closer. But with a softer grass like POA or bent, I think it's common to have something that's not as good as these Zoysia grains. So I enjoyed looking at those videos, and I'm so glad that I got a chance to share them with you.
Yeah, it's cool to see that Zoysia roll. That is yeah, the difference in species definitely is evident from what I see there after play. And actually, it's one of the reasons. So a new project we're working on this year is we are taking our traffic studies to golf courses in the Met area, New York City. So actually, we already started this. We do 1 or 2 reps of 5 different anchor shoes, we call them, and we have our aggressive walker doing the walking on these practice greens, and we're taking GS3, we're taking bobble test, visual spike damage, step meter readings, and then we're getting information from the superintendents on their maintenance practices. So how they use PGRs and nitrogen, what height they mow the grass at, what the species composition is, bent, POA, is it somewhere in between, top dressing events, cultivation events, and OM2. And so we're interested in what factors make a green susceptible to damage or resilient to traffic damage. And already we've seen things at the very different ends of the spectrum, greens that got really disrupted by our traffic method and greens that basically didn't show any of that. And this is actually where Maggie Ryder, you just had Maggie on a couple times in the last couple of months. She's helping us with the data analysis, and we're doing random forest algorithms to include weather data and try and predict the damage we might see from traffic based on weather factors, maintenance factors, and the type of shoe. So it is really interesting how so far we've sort of found some interesting things that, man, it may not be the shoe, it's more the person walking, or it's the sort of level of moisture that's in the air, in the canopy, and how that creates a little more susceptibility to the bent and POA species to traffic. But that is our next frontier, is figuring out how do we manage to reduce that traffic damage that we see, and what can you do as a superintendent to mitigate that.
It's really interesting. I'm going to be working tournaments back-to-back weeks, doing the bobble test and stuff. I'll be at the U.S. Amateur, which is on bentgrass greens in August, and then I'll be back at KBC Augusta at Kea Golf Club on Zoysia greens. So in fact, I'll miss the Saturday afternoon because I'll be on an airplane. I'll miss the Monday practice round because I'll still be on an airplane because it's on the other side of the world. But yes. If all the flights go well, I'll be there early. I'll be there before sunrise on Tuesday of the practice rounds and be able to duplicate that chart. And I think it's always interesting because every year something that I've found so useful that I never knew. I always thought benchmarking, which is kind of a New Zealand term. Keith McAuliffe, who was with the New Zealand Sports Turf Institute for many years, he'd often recommend benchmarking. And then STRI in the UK, they were recommending benchmarking, measuring the playing performance. And I always thought, like, I don't need to benchmark. I don't need to measure what these things are and track it year over year. I can go do the work. I know how to do the work. I'm just going to work harder and make amazing surfaces. I don't need to do this writing stuff down and benchmarking. Well, it turns out that benchmarking has been so valuable for me in the type of advice that I can give to golf course superintendents, and in what the decisions that golf course superintendents can make. It's so predictable. I've had I've had so many conversations with superintendents about how predictable the green speed is, how predictable the firmness is, how predictable the bobble test is. If you know what it was last year and you know the work that you did last year and you're like, okay, here's a couple of flaws that we didn't like about last year, let's fix them. And
Yeah.
so whether that's making it more consistent from green to green, whether it's making it a little bit firmer, whether it's not brushing and rolling more, something like that. And then you get the result from last year with the expected change. So I'm always excited, like at Kea, for the KBC Augusta tournament last year, they'd actually done some cultivation in
Okay.
June. And this year, there's going to be no holes punched on the greens. So I'm expecting that the bobble test will be able to be a little bit smoother this year. And last year, the grass was growing too much because they'd done but we knew it because we've got all this benchmarking data from the tournament week from 2013 up until now.
Right.
And it's very predictable. If the grass grows too fast, you don't have a really good speed. And if you've punched holes, the ball snakes. And so there should be less snaking this year. You mentioned that you didn't really see any chatter. You didn't see much chatter. We saw more snaking. And so the idea this year is, well, there's going to be no holes punched. So we're going to ideally have very little chatter. There were no bobbles. The ball doesn't leave the ground. So that's not really a concern. And we're going to try to minimize snaking this year. So hopefully we won't have to put so much fertilizer to repair from those aerification holes and so on. It's just so useful to have those data to where and then people might be, well, why aren't you punching holes? Well, we have OM246 data that says we don't need to punch holes. So it turns out to be really useful. And I suppose that everybody that does this comes to the same conclusion.
Yeah, it's just the idea of putting a number to what you see. And I think that's the great part about the bobble test is it walks the line between perception of what golfers perceive and what a good golfer will perceive as a smooth and true green, but also having a number to quantify that perception. And that's really useful because it gives your brain an idea of, okay, this was a 7.5. Man, 8 is what I deem the minimum sort of acceptable tournament quality. Okay, I need to get an extra half a point. And last year when I did X, Y, and Z, I was at 8.2. And then I changed some things this year and it got worse. So now I sort of know, okay, the different things I did, or maybe the weather impacted it differently, led to a 0.7 reduction. Okay, how do I get back up to 8.2 or 8.5 or 9? And the analogy I've used, whether it's MLSN, measuring your soil nutrients, whether it's clipping volume, measure how much you grow, is a golfer, when they're standing in the fairway, they don't sort of just look back to see where the 150-yard marker is and then look forward at the 100 and say, I'm closer to 150. I'm going to play this as a 150 shot. Or I'm closer to 100. I'll play as a 100 shot. No, they have a rangefinder or they step it off to figure out, okay, I'm 132 yards. That gives me an idea as opposed to like rounding with, I think people like the idea of using their feel as greenkeepers and using that sort of artistic side and knowing, sort of what to do just as you go about your work. But having the number to benchmark that feel is really important because it gives you that added ability to control things and dial things in and focus on details that you wouldn't otherwise have if you didn't have a number and you were just putting some balls around and say, oh yeah, it's good. Or, oh no, it's not so good. Well, I want to know how far away we are from good or how far above we are from that minimum threshold, because that gives me added information to scale my practices in a certain way.
Yeah, I think there's always a huge amount of art and creativity involved in greenkeeping. And what I've noticed every time I embed myself with a golf course maintenance team, whether that's just on one of my sabbaticals or whether it's during a tournament, but especially on my sabbaticals where we're just doing everyday maintenance and I go to the shop every morning and attend the morning meeting and go around the course, I've noticed how much indecision is involved of should we make the fungicide application today or should we skip it? Should we top dress or should we skip top dressing? Do these greens need vented or not? Should we raise the mowing height or not? What do we do about water? Is it, are the greens getting worse because of that last wetting agent we made in the high temperatures, or are they just getting or the greens look a little bit worse just because of the high temperatures? And you've got all of the, and then somebody didn't show up for, and then you've got like somebody's out sick, and so you don't even have enough staff, and then the rough needs mowed, and you've got all this indecision about things that are related to weather and how the grass is performing. And what I find is there's always, you're making decisions with limited information. You're making decisions that are based on your style of greenkeeping, the way that if you tend to want to keep it dry, or you tend to want to keep the grass growing, or you tend to want to roll more and mow less, or you tend to not like rolling and you like to get speed with extra mowing or whatever, that's always there. But no matter what kind of greenkeeper you are, in whatever kind of grass and whatever climate, having some of these key measurements and just knowing where you're at, and it allows you to compare to the past. If you want to, you can compare to your peers, and it allows you to see what the results of your activities are, and in both the short term and in the long term. So,
it clarifies decision making for me. Like it allows you to identify, okay, how far off from what I want. And then I have a bunch of tools as a superintendent. I can use my artistic ability to, if my green speed is, let's say a foot off of where I want it, I have a bunch of tools I can deploy to get that extra
silica. Did you miss a silica app?
I did. A silica.
Oh, good one. Yeah. And so anybody that's still listening to this knows that I'm not a huge fan of silica as a way to increase green speed, for the obvious reasons that, for example, zoysia grass is notorious for having a very slow green speed, and it also has a very high silica content of the leaves. So making leaf blades stiffer is unlikely to make them faster.
Yeah. So, and I like to draw analogies for people. Like in golf, if you look at a golf practice range, and I'm sure you go to the range every once in a while at either KA or you'll probably be there at the USM, you see players now have a lot of sort of anchors or these benchmarks that they use in their practice sessions so that they're at least controlling a couple variables, whether it's alignment sticks for their setup, whether it's a launch monitor that's telling them their club face direction at impact and path at impact. On the putting greens, you'll see a lot of mirrors and lines and tees. And all of that is for them to control certain parts about their golf. If it's their alignment, their eyes are over the ball in a certain way, their feet are a certain distance apart, the ball position is such. They're trying to control for those variables so that they have less other variables to think about. And you just listed like 20 things a superintendent has to deal with, decision makings on a daily basis that they have to make. And these benchmark points allow you to sort of not worry about a couple of those variables and bring everything back to those touch points and sort of simplify the decision-making process, as opposed to not knowing those values and then just winging it all over the place, which is like a typical amateur golfer is just sort of winging it all over the place.
Maybe that's why I don't get better. Yeah. Maybe I should get a rangefinder.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, that exhausts all of the things that I wanted to talk about with you, that I was so looking forward to talking about. So is there anything else that you want to bring up before we end this show?
I don't think so. We're really interested in our research, taking our traffic research to actual golf courses. We're going to do it at a bunch of high-end places in the Met, and then we're also going to try and do it at some more maybe daily fee courses next year to get some of that data. And I think that'll be really interesting.
So basically instead of doing it all at Cornell, where you just have one soil or like two soil types and two grass types, now you're going to get, by taking it to multiple properties, you've got different grass types, different soil types, and different management of those grasses, which you mentioned you're looking at the OM2 at different places, and you'll have different mowing heights and different nitrogen rates and so on. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that will, I think, give us some good information. At least for New York superintendents, you're probably going to extend it to the Northeast, but what are characteristics of managing the surface that make it more or less prone to that damage, and how can you improve those things to give your golfers in the afternoon? A lot of people golf in the afternoon, right after work or something like that. We're having an increase in golf demand
in the United States.
Yep. And
not in Japan.
Not in Japan. Okay, interesting.
No, that's why I've been so. Have you read some of my stuff about frost delays in Japan? Because people make a tee time, and the tee times are all in the morning, and so if you have a frost delay, that means you're telling the golfers, please don't come play today, and so you're turning away in a day. It's thousands of dollars, and over the course of a winter season with 60 frost days, it's $1 million or more. And but yeah, it's because everything's based on tee times, and people don't play in the afternoon generally. Which makes it. But then in that golfing culture, because people aren't playing in the afternoon, the last golfers are off the course by 3 p.m. or something, or certainly they're off. Generally, they're off 1 and 10 tee, because people are doing 2 tee starts. So they're off those tees by 2:30 or something. So you can then come in behind them, fix the bunkers, change the hole locations, get them set up for tomorrow, put the frost covers out, and set the tee markers and stuff. So you can do a lot of the work the night before. Then the next morning, you don't have to set the hole location. You just have to pull the frost covers off. And
interesting.
So it's different, and then it's like, well, that's a solution to the Japanese or Korean type of golf market. But then, in the U.S., it's like, oh wait, they're playing all day. When can you ever do anything? So it's tough. I've got one more question I wanted to ask you. I still see a lot of golf course superintendents go out and they're venting and top dressing. And by venting, I mean small solid tines. And I'm just like, that has to mess up the quality of the ball roll. And for the life of me, I can't understand. If people would put less nitrogen, then they don't have to put so much sand. And if they wouldn't punch the holes, the greens would be better. What are people doing? What's the why are people doing that? Because to me, it makes the greens objectively worse. If you go play on it on Sunday versus Tuesday morning, the greens are going to be better on Sunday. They're worse on Tuesday. And then I'm not quite sure what that's accomplishing.
I think superintendents would tell you, gas exchange, relieve compaction, but do you have a compaction problem or improve infiltration, right? These are things you read in a textbook. Hey, we're doing all those things, but did you ever measure those things is the question I ask. Well, no. And then just like you, I'm like, so why do we do it? And Frank Rossi will say they just have an addiction to cultivation. And I think there's part of it, at least in the US at high-end places, where they have to sort of schedule events and get their time to do maintenance days in the midst of a really busy golfing calendar during the year. And a lot of times if they have that maintenance day, it's sort of like, hey, I got to do something with my day here because the next 6 days, I'm not going to have any ability to do it. And I think sometimes that is the driving factor, that instead of maybe reasoning your way through why I need to do X, Y, and Z, it's sort of like, oh, this is my day. Like, I got to do it now.
Well, maybe, because I think if you do the bobble test, you're going to find that if you skip that, your bobble test score is going to be better through the year. And for me, I say that if you're doing this, we're trying to maximize the number of days in the year above whatever our minimum threshold is. So if we want the bobble test to be 8 and we want the green speed to be above 10, then we just have to count the days in the year that we accomplish that. And every time you're punching holes and spreading sand, I think that it's bringing the bobble test down, and it's probably bringing the speed down a little bit as well. And I'm just like, man, I wish people would would count it in this way, because I want to optimize the playing conditions. Maybe the GS3 ball, for people that have the GS3 ball, they will also. But if people aren't thinking that way, if they're just using it but not using it as a decision making tool, then I'm not sure that it helps anything.
Yeah, and I think that's, I follow John Riley on Twitter, and John is a person who takes that data as actionable. And I think he's sort of on Twitter, he's explained, okay, how that data has changed how he's managed his surfaces. But you're right. If people just take it as like a way to measure if their greens are good or not, without thinking of okay, do I need to do anything different with the maintenance based on these numbers? You're right. I think it's not super useful in that regard. So yeah, it's again, I think um, it's good. I think it's okay to be reactionary when it comes to, do I need to poke holes? Like, and that needs to get triggered by certain, okay, my infiltration is bad, or my greens are too firm and they're not draining, or, I'm losing grass because they're so compacted. Like, that's the trigger to do those things, as opposed to like, I think what a lot of superintendents have to do is schedule these things in like January, because they got a golf calendar, and then they're like, okay, well, I just got to schedule August, is my core aeration, or my late spring aeration. That's a big thing sort of around here. You pull cores and put sand in, even if you got USGA greens, like, you're planning that out 4 months in advance. Is that the best course of action? But a lot of times they're sort of pigeonholed into that because of the golf calendar. So I think there's probably a bit of, okay, hey, they're not reasoning through it, but also like, hey, they're getting boxed in to a certain extent.
Yeah, I understand that you've only got limited times to do it, and you think you have to do it. I guess.
For people, I'm noticing a trend that there is less, I think, more people who are saying, yeah, I haven't poked a hole in a couple years. And I think that is growing. And the more superintendents that start saying that, the more it gets around. And we do these field days in upstate New York for our local GCSA-NY organization. And Frank hammers them on that stuff. And I think you could see a lot of guys think, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I could do other things instead of poking holes. And so I think there's growing movement, but yeah, it's going to take some time for sure.
There's no doubt that you're going to grow deeper roots if you put fertilizer and punch holes. Of course, that's not the objective. Deeper roots is not the objective, but if you're going to have like more roots, if you want to like quantify healthier grass that way, punching holes and putting more nitrogen is going to grow more grass. But greenkeeping is not about growing grass as much as it is about making a playing surface. And I think maybe the GS3 ball bobble test, which I'm kind of evangelizing for here, and knowing that we haven't had this conversation before. I anticipated that that's how you would respond about it, because it's so easy and it's a meaningful number, and anybody can do it. So I see that the GS3 starts to go to Canada. I saw somebody in Europe has one, but basically, if you're in Japan, if you're in Vietnam, if you're in China, if you're in Australia, you're probably not going to have a GS3 ball. I really like the bobble test if you want to quantify these kind of things. So I'm glad we can talk about that. And if people would focus on the outcome of the quality of the golfing surface, I think we can really fine tune the work. And if we need to put sand, then we'll absolutely put sand. If we need to punch holes, absolutely punch holes. But otherwise, let's just make nice golfing surfaces and play some golf.
I agree.
Awesome. Well, Carl, I look forward to catching up again. But for now, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I really appreciate it, and making time to talk with me and sharing so much cool information and really nice insight.
Of course, Micah, happy to do it. Thanks for having me on today.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for listening, for watching. I'll put a few links in the show notes. I'll sign off now for ATC from Trong, Thailand. I'm Michael Wood.